Tom Vigil, whatever happened to the epistle to the Laodiceans? Just curious. Don't get me started. Dude, do you have any idea what a soapbox that is for me? Do you not know? I got big opinions about the Laodicean epistle. Now, I know everybody's saying, no, Joel, it's Laodicean. Yeah, but in the Greek, it's Laodicean. And I think that sounds way more cool. All right, let's go through Colossians 4. Colossians 4. Let's start in verse 15. Salute the brethren which are in Laodicea. That's how it's pronounced in the Greek. I think that's an awesome way to say it. Laodicea and Nymphas and the church which is in his house. And when this epistle is read among you, cause that it be read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that ye likewise read the epistle from Laodicea, and say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which thou hast received in the Lord, that thou fulfill it. So let's start with that whole region of Laodicea. Let me see. Oh, look at this. It is here. Let's see if that region works out well. Okay, so here we go. Is this? Colossae is part of a tri-city region that includes Colossae, Laodicea, and Hierapolis. Okay, so I have to skip over all of this. Here we go. Now here with those red stars, you see that tri-city region. Laodicea was the wealthiest and the greatest of those three cities. And Laodicea was known for its manufacturing of clothing and its school of medicine. And do you know what they were famous for developing? Eye drops. They mixed water with this, I guess, powder made from Phrygian stone or something. And they put it in a collyrium, and voila, you had eye drops. And of course, the Laodicean church, mentioned in Revelation 3 as the church that's neither hot nor cold. And he's not talking about this church that Paul references in Colossians 4. He's talking about John was talking about the Lord, I should say, was talking about a synagogue of Jews who are part of that prophetic program about his kingdom on earth. But interesting enough, in Revelation 3:18, the Lord tells him, and anoint thine eyes with eye salve that thou mayest see. Now, the word eye salve isn't mentioned anywhere else in Scripture, and some suggest that the Lord may have been referencing the very eye drops that were developed in Laodicea. Now, notice what we read in Colossians 4 here. Paul wants these men to go to Laodicea. In verse 16, he says he wants them to go to the church of the Laodiceans. There is only one church in Laodicea. He wants them to go to that one church. He wants the Colossian epistle to be read in that one church. And he wants those men to read the epistle to the Laodiceans. And what does he say? In verse 17, he says, and say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which thou hast received in the Lord, that thou fulfill it. Where is Archippus located? Right? He has to be in Laodicea. Paul says, look, go to Laodicea, share this Colossian epistle, read their epistle, and while you're there, give this message to Archippus. I mean, verse 17 starts with the word and. It's a continuation of his thought in verse 16. Archippus had to be in Laodicea. And do you remember Archippus? He's mentioned at the beginning of the Philemon epistle. He's the master of horses. He's the fellow soldier referenced in Philemon. And most likely, he's viewed as the pastor of the church in Philemon's house. So if Archippus lived in Laodicea, then so must Philemon, Apphia, and the church that's in Philemon's house. And if there's only one church in Laodicea, then that church can only be the one that's in Philemon's house. Which means that this reference to the epistle of Laodicea had to be nothing less than Paul's letter to Philemon. Now, there are some things I wouldn't fight over. I'll totally go to the mat on the epistle to Laodiceans. It's conclusive to me in Colossians 4. That has to be the Philemon letter. It can't be anything else. There's only one church in Laodicea. Okay, so you might say, well, Joel, why would Paul call this letter to Philemon the epistle from Laodicea? Why doesn't he just call it Philemon's letter? Well, it was the translators that called that letter Paul's epistle to Philemon but you remember, the Philemon letter wasn't only addressed to Philemon. The letter was addressed to his family and the entire church that's in his house. It was addressed to everybody in that church, Philemon included. A more accurate title for that letter would have been the Epistle to Laodiceans. A lot of people write that, Philemon was a personal letter. It was never personal because that letter had always been addressed to every person in his church. And I know what some are thinking, well, now, wait a minute, Joel. Wait just a minute. What about that Nymphas guy in verse 15? Wasn't he in Laodicea? Didn't he have a church that's in his house? Yes, he did. Well, now, how do you explain that, Joel? Nymphas is a big deal. Nymphas is a big deal. I have a lot to say about Nymphas also, but Archippus. And let's talk real quickly about Archippus. I've got a big theory about Archippus. Now, this is a theory. This is Joelology. I'm not dogmatic about this, but it's a theory that fits the facts very conveniently. Why did Paul send that message to Archippus? Why did Paul tell Archippus to take heed to the ministry which thou hast received in the Lord, that thou fulfill it? Well, what happened to Archippus? Everybody in all the books, they're all like, well, we can't know what happened to Archippus. Some guys like Bullinger would speculate that Colossians was written around 61, 62 AD. And do you know what happened before that in 60 AD in Laodicea? Laodicea had a massive earthquake that leveled the entire city. It was a mega disaster. I mean, on a par with Hurricane Helene, maybe worse. And this disaster actually had the entire Roman Empire talking at the time. Rome itself would send word to the Laodiceans that they'd be willing to send men and money and resources to help build that city. And do you know what they told Rome? No, you can keep your men. You can keep your money. We're going to rebuild our own city. Thank you very much. And that's exactly what they did. Even Tacitus, I read Tacitus years ago. Tacitus was considered to be a Roman senator. He wrote a book called Annals, Annals, and he said, one of the most famous cities of Asia, Laodicea, was in the same year overthrown by an earthquake and without any relief from us, recovered itself by its own resources. Isn't that amazing? So now you can piece it all together. Colossians was written after that massive earthquake in Laodicea. Archippus was in Laodicea, and now we can understand why Archippus was struggling in the ministry. He was devastated by the earthquake. In fact, he was so devastated, he practically couldn't function. He lost people he loved. In fact, I think a lot of the people mentioned in Philemon probably died in the earthquake. And this is Archippus. Archippus, who was called a fellow soldier in Philemon. He was now a broken man. And what does Paul tell him by inspiration of the Spirit? I think he told Archippus exactly what he needed to hear. He said, take heed to the ministry which thou hast received in the Lord, that thou fulfill it. I mean, he talks to him like a soldier. You get back on your feet. You go out there and win that war. That was tough love. But I think those were the very words he needed to hear. Ministry is never so important as it is after the wake of a great disaster like that. Okay, so this begs the question. If Archippus lived in Laodicea and there was a massive earthquake in 60 AD, what happened to Philemon and Apphia? I think they died. You know, when you think about 2 Timothy 1:15, how all they which are in Asia be turned away from me, that verse always bothered me, because how could Philemon walk away from Paul? Because he lived in Asia. I think he was dead by that point because of the earthquake. And I'll show you something else. This is, I don't know if this is still in the PowerPoint here. Look at the PowerPoint. Oh, Laodicea, Colossae. Wow, it really messed up the wording there. Oh yeah, look at this. I talked about this years ago on the podcast. House with church unearthed in Laodicea. Can you believe that? This is from the Hürriyet Daily News. It's a big news source in Turkey. The article would explain that this was a wealthy first century house that had a room for a Christian church. And this house had been probably leveled by that 60 AD earthquake. What did it look like? We know it had a peristylium, which is an open-aired courtyard surrounded by columned corridors. You know, it looks like this. Let me get over here. Looks like this. Looks like that. I may have gotten that from Assassin's Creed, just so we could know what a peristylium is. And the church was in a room off to the side of that courtyard. They also said they unearthed very rich marble coverings on the walls of the eastern hall, which was converted into a church. In the middle of the house, there is a hall with 18 columns, and he had 20 rooms, baths, shelters, and other sections that were used as a places of business. And the most surprising thing about this house is that we know why they were so wealthy. The house was adjacent to an amphitheater. Look at this. I think I have an image of that on the PowerPoint also. Yeah, there you go. It was adjacent to an amphitheater. They ran an amphitheater, and that's how they were enormously wealthy. See that? Oh, yeah. And there's the archaeology in the New Testament book. Let me go back to the amphitheater. I wonder what shows they put on in that amphitheater, personally. You know, Cicero once wrote of gladiator games in Laodicea. But then after that earthquake, they lost everything, including that big amphitheater. Everything was destroyed. So now you can think of Philemon if you go see Gladiator 2. So here's how I think it all played out. I think Philemon was written first. I think Philemon released Onesimus just as Paul had asked. He sent Onesimus back to Paul in Rome. Then we had the earthquake in Laodicea in 60 AD. Colossians was written a few months after that. And I think Philemon and Colossians were the last two prison epistles Paul wrote before he was released from prison. Now, this brings us back to Nymphus, and I'll close with this. Go back to Colossians 4:15. Salute the brethren which are in Laodicea and Nymphas and the church which is in his house. Do you see what happened? Colossians was written after the earthquake in Laodicea. Philemon died, and I think his house was destroyed. So the church that was meeting in Philemon's house relocated to the house of Nymphas. I'll bet you money. I can't wait to get to glory to see if I'm right about this. I'm sure I am. But I think that's what happened. That's why Nymphas is mentioned here in verse 15, and why Archippus is also mentioned in verse 17, and why there's still only one church in Laodicea. It's the same church that was in Philemon's house that's now relocated to Nymphas's house. And this is why the house the archaeologists discovered in Laodicea couldn't have been Nymphas's house, because it's apparent from Colossians 4 that Nymphas's house wasn't destroyed by the earthquake. And I'll just close with this. There's a book called Archaeology and the New Testament by John McRae. I bought that book. Do I still have that on the PowerPoint? I bought that book as preparation for the sermon I did at Brian's conference. You can get it on Kindle. He had a section devoted to Laodicea. And he wrote that archaeologists discovered an ancient inscription in Laodicea dedicated by a servant to the master who freed him. And do you know what the master's name was? Marcus Cestius Philemon.